Welcome to the Ignatius Press podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Petiprin, joined today by Father Donald Haggerty, who is a priest of the Archdiocese of New York, who serves at the great St. Patrick's Cathedral. He has taught moral theology, he has served as a spiritual director in seminaries, and he has directed retreats worldwide for the Missionaries of Charity. Father Haggerty is the author of numerous books on spirituality, and today we will be discussing his new book from Ignatius Press, which is called The Hour of Testing, Spiritual Depth and Insight in a Time of Ecclesial Uncertainty. Father Haggerty, welcome to the Ignatius Press podcast. How are you?
Thank you very much, Andrew. I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Well, I'm really interested to talk to you about your book. It's a really great book, the way that it's laid out. It's very deep. It's very, very thought-provoking. It's definitely written by somebody who is writing from a very deep well of not only theological knowledge, but pastoral experience and just kind of insight into the culture. But I love the way that you break up the book into these sort of bits. Like even within the chapters, there are these blocks that are divided by these little lines where you express like bite-sized thoughts, almost like you could sit down with it and read just a chunk one day at a time. Was that intentional?
That is intentional, and I have written my other books in that mode of fashion, and except for the book on St. John of the Cross. And frankly, it's because I've written that way because this is how I've used my time sometimes to write these small, concentrated, brief, but very focused meditations. And then when I get enough together, they seem to flow into one another. And then I just have to arrange them.
Well, I think it's very generous of you for your readers to we know we live in this world where sometimes it's very difficult to sit down for an extended period of time and really devote a long stretch of our attention span to a particular idea, and that's just the way things are. It's not ideal. But for you as an author, I mean, I'm taking inspiration for that myself in my own writing. I think that's something I want to do in the future, is to kind of honor my reader, or as you do, with just enough to get them thinking. I appreciated that.
And I did like very much reading years ago Henri de Lubac's Paradoxes of Faith, published by Ignatius Press. And I have to say, I've been influenced by that kind of writing, those concentrated, focused, brief less than one page paragraphs.
Yeah. Well, they really deliver the goods. And, despite the fact, or maybe because of the fact that you give us your ideas in these chunks, there's a lot to think about in this book that you have produced. And, I think when somebody picks up this book off the shelf, they'll see a lot of, I don't know, almost a kind of, some ominous words almost, the hour of testing. And then, I was really drawn to this one word, uncertainty, that's in the subtitle there. Tell us about that word. Like for you as a pastor, for you as a theologian, as somebody looking out on the culture, what do you see? What's uncertain about the world that we live in? I mean, it seems obvious to some of us, but there are very key things that I think you draw out in the book that I just love for you to kind of, to draw us into what you're doing here.
Well, my primary thought on uncertainty is ecclesial uncertainty, which is in the title. And where are we going in the church? That's a question. But, we can't predict history. We don't know what happens, even from one papacy to the next. We don't know what happens in the developments of time. But I think we are I used this phrase a few times in the book, we could be seeing the birth pangs of a time of serious grave magnitude in the history of the church. And there are certain, questions. There's uncertainty how far the church itself might push, developments, and will they go over a line, let's say, in certain ways. So there's uncertainties that would be dangerous, could be precarious. And it's not just that we hope everything goes back to a past that we were more comfortable with, but all things are somehow in God's vision and his plan, his providential care. And we do have, there is speculation today about the second coming of Christ. And I'm not really saying that in this book, but I am saying the 21st century might have serious things happen here. Much depends on what happens in the church, I think, not so much in the geopolitical area. The culture itself, we all, I think, as good Catholics, experience the darkness that is out there now. How dark does it get as time, continues now in this century?
Yeah, I mean, I'm struck by that because you'll sometimes hear people want to minimize maybe the concerns that some people have about the state of the church or about the relationship between the church and the world. And they'll say something like, look, there's nothing to worry about. We've had Borgia popes, we've had persecutions, we've had all these horrible times, and we've had the French Revolution, we've had all these horrible moments in the life of the church and in the West. This too will pass. The gates of hell will not prevail. And yet there are some of us, though, who hear that and we go, yeah, that makes sense. And yet something also does feel different now. Is that fair?
I would totally agree with you, Andrew. And to me, the question right now it's a serious question whether the church in some manner might alter some teaching that would be considered irreversible doctrinal teaching. And I placed that in the book too, that question. I mean, what will they do on this question of homosexuality, homosexual acts? Even the question that's been raised of, the change in teaching on artificial contraception. The fact that these things are being discussed even at high levels in the church, or that cardinals in the church have proposed a change in that teaching on homosexual acts. The fact that that's even discussed, raises the question whether you could have a rupture in some way in irreformable, doctrinal teaching. And we have not seen that in the history of the church. We have had corrupt, people in leadership in the church, but not doctrinal wounds of that nature. And it could be a sign of the times. That would be unprecedented if that would happen. And it could be only the beginning of what could be what's happening.
I'm intrigued that you use the term "sign of the times." Of course, John Paul II and Benedict XVI both like to use that turn of phrase. And I think reading their writings, there's a lot that's prophetic about what they're saying that is now becoming clearer as we move well into the 21st century and are facing things that maybe even they didn't quite imagine we would be facing.
Yeah, I agree, and it's not just what we would say now an increasing crisis of faith, but a question of as I place in the book, it's kind of an undercurrent of a theme in the book, whether we might see Jesus reliving his passion within the church itself. So we know as a truth, the church cannot, be lost. But it's possible that the church may suffer internally a great wound, and that Jesus will relive in a mysterious way the last week of his passion. Now that's not an original idea. That's been proposed at times. I believe von Balthasar spoke of that at one time. And the reality of the church not having a schism in the church, I don't believe that's going to happen, but that, really faithful, holy souls may suffer from seeing the church, in some manner, not go off the rails, but be proposing things that would be, unacceptable in a previous period of the church.
Yeah. And to that point, one of the things that comes up in various ways in your book is, is just how we live in this strange reality now where even in past times where the church had crises, there was still kind of like the water that everybody was swimming in was still kind of religious or even metaphysical. You use that term in the book, and it feels like now the water we're swimming in is different. And, I love how throughout the book, you put these great quotes from different theologians and thinkers and of the past and the present. And in one place, towards the beginning of the book, you have the Henri de Lubac line, whom you mentioned before, de Lubac, where he said, modernity refuses mystery. And it does feel like as long as that's the kind of water we're swimming in, then the church is really going to struggle to figure out its identity, because it just can't count on any of this like kind of enculturation as it would have had in the past. Am I right on that?
I think you're totally right. And the fact is the culture itself, and I do have a focus of this in the book. The culture is becoming very indifferent to God. And I think there's a difference between, periods of time when we could say it in the 19th century where a rising hostility, an atheistic spirit began to, be prevalent because of the Enlightenment, the post-Enlightenment period. Now you see, I think, a massive apathy in many cases to God in a wider, population. Now, we don't see this, I think, so much in the United States because we do have many religious believers. We have, at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, we have people who fill that church. And I think in general, there is a strong presence of Catholic practice in the United States. But go to Europe, and what happens in the coming generation when the young people who are teenagers, even in their 20s now, who are going through the college scene right now, where the darkness is very real, what kind of adults will they be in their religious practice? And it might be that, a very widespread indifference to God takes hold. An apathy, it really doesn't matter. It doesn't have a concern for people. And I think, that might be what's going to happen as time goes on in these decades to come.
Yeah, sometimes I worry, Father. I live in Texas, and I've lived in other parts of the South where even places that aren't historically Catholic, the regions are so religious, so Christian, that the Catholics in these places are very fervent, very faithful, and these churches are enormous and heaving with people. But I sometimes worry that almost can lull church leadership into a false sense of security. That there are just so many levers to pull on the old machine that they're just going to keep pulling them until they run out of time and, they retire or they die or whatever that may be. But what's coming next is the thing that, I just wonder if there's enough kind of heart and soul going into the concern for that. Because as you say, things changed in Europe pretty quickly and they could change here pretty quickly as well. Maybe towards what this line that I love, that you call the banality of unbelief, that maybe we're headed in a direction like that.
Yeah, I think in the past it might have been, even when I was a young person, if a young person from a Catholic background embraced non-belief in God, that was a very, radical rebellion and a hostile, person, no doubt, toward, religious practice of the past. But now I think there's just a drifting away among many people. I see a contrast. I see very fervent young people who are going to Mass sometimes every day, but they're a small segment. And, the very materialistic, worldly, view seems to be strong. And I always remember, and I like the statement of Mother Teresa liked to say, indifference is the great evil. And she may have been referring to an indifference to, poor people, but also indifference to God, and I think that apathy, that, unbelief without passion, without a concerted rejection of God, I think that is a danger of the time now. And I don't think we see it so much. We don't see it in older people, but I wonder what's going to happen to the COVID generation who grew up in and has gone to school during these, the Biden years, and that college scene has been very, very dark and anti-religious in this time, I believe. Let's see what happens with them as they enter into their 20s and 30s and 40s.
Yeah, much remains to be seen. I suppose there's some hope that maybe there will be a kind of pendulum swing back away from that maybe the COVID years and the this sort of really almost, frankly, apocalyptic time we've been living through, where there really has been a kind of unveiling or a revealing, and maybe people are going to see something finally. I don't know. I'm hopeful.
Yeah, I'm hopeful too. But I, to be honest, I think it's going to be more remnant, intense spirituality in a portion of people, and that will be, the heart of the church.
Mm-hmm.
And you do see, good young priests coming up, but then again, in some dioceses like New York, we have very few vocations. So we have a seminary that's, almost with very few men. Mm-hmm. So, and this is New York, where we have a huge population. So it depends on the place. Wichita, Kansas, I think, has the highest amount of vocations in the United States. But so there are places where there are, response in that manner, but other places where it's a bit dark.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. You alluded a moment ago to the second coming. Let's spend a little bit of time on that, and let me set this up by saying this. I was not raised Catholic. I was raised evangelical, and we had a kind of second coming spirituality. We were thinking about the end times a fair bit, and kind of, I grew up kind of thinking like at any moment the Antichrist might sort of walk onto the stage, and we might be raptured, and there's the whole various theological streams to carry us forward on that. But I have tended to find as a Catholic that it's not something that's talked about very much. And if someone talks about it, that person would usually be regarded as a little fringe. And yet, our Lord's return is something we profess in the Creed. I mean, it is absolutely what we're pinning our hope on ultimately. So are we right to be thinking about it and wondering if maybe we are approaching the moment when the Lord might come back and complete the work?
Well, Andrew, I'm writing about this a bit in this book, and but I'm not writing it in that kind of fervent, fevered manner, which sometimes has been common in talk about the second coming. But I think the birth pang possibility is real, and I think we will see what happens. We have to see what happens in the church, what happens in the culture, and one reality of this is not so much the second coming as a focus, but are we preparing in some way for, yes, the emergence of some kind of Antichrist figure? Now doesn't seem to be on the horizon right now, but I include in this book the paragraph of Soloviev and also Joseph Pieper, and when he wrote in the end of his book about that possibility in our own time. So I think it's good to be alert to that. My great concern is the what happens in the church, and I think a large part of this book is then how do we live a more serious spirituality if it's true that Jesus will be in some manner showing us more deeply his own passion within the church. So how to, incorporate that into our own lives also, to suffer with him in what we see around us.
Yeah, I almost wonder, you don't want to be unnecessarily alarmist, but you almost want to pose a hypothetical question to your typical mass goer and say, look, what if in 10 years it was illegal for you to come here? Or what if in 20 years, there were only 5 of you who would come, or something, like to kind of really, I don't know, maybe I'm being alarmist to even think that way, but just to kind of imagine like what really is at stake for us. Like what if our faith becomes completely unrespectable at some point in the future, or maybe even dangerous to practice? What does that mean?
I mean, it's a great question, Andrew, because, history sometimes moves very fast. And in the 1930s, 1929 to 1939, you have huge shifts in what happened in the world. And I think even in our own 2020s, we've had some very volatile movement in time there culturally. And, we have the new administration now with Trump, but there's a lot of unknowns. What happens internationally, what happens in our own country. There could be a backlash after the Trump years. And that's just in the worldly, secular realm. I think it's a question that is very serious. It's serious at this moment. What happens in the next papacy? Because that will be a very telling thing. Do we continue to have ambiguity in Catholic teaching, kind of doctrinal vagueness? What happens over time? And you may have noticed that just today, as we were doing this talk, this conversation, I think it was in the last 2 days, they mentioned in Brazil. I just came back from Brazil after doing a retreat with the Missionaries of Charity. And there was a consecration of a bishop, I believe, with an Anglican bishop there, receiving communion. All the photos are there. And, these things that happen in one diocese in Brazil, where they have a serious background of liberation theology. But those kind of things are not inconceivable, spreading around the church in time. So let's see what happens. And we have to keep our seatbelts on as time goes on.
Right. And I think one of the significant things on top of just the fact that bishop was Anglican was it was a woman Anglican bishop. So really quite shocking. I agree with you that there may be more of that sort of thing, and it will be. I think we're reaching this moment. This is summed up in the title of your book, The Hour of Testing. There will be big tests, I think, for the church, and especially for our Holy Father, our current one, and our next one, whoever he may be, that will have to be faced. Both in terms of those kind of ecclesial things like that, but probably also with regard to things like the church's relationship with nations, with international organizations, with just so many. The world is just so complex now, and the church needs somebody, really agile and faithful and committed to face these challenges.
Yeah, we need, in some manner, we need to be maybe more aggressive, perhaps, in the leadership of the church toward a culture that is dark, and to realize there is a battle. I also include in this book a certain number of references. My sense of we are facing satanic realities in all this also. So the presence of the evil one is real, and he is at work. The battle between light and darkness is very prevalent today. So that I'm conscious of that also in this book, and how, Jesus suffered in his passion. He suffered in his public life from that presence of the evil one. They were accusing him even early on in his public life of being, performing miracles by the power of Beelzebul. And so I think the presence of the evil one is at work here too, to be aware of that.
Well, and speaking of that, I am one anyway who is sympathetic to the idea that certain technological innovations are ripe for the evil one to take over and use against us. I'm no pure technophobe or Luddite, but I tend not to be of the school that says, "Oh, these technologies are just tools." Like they're just, I tend to be a little more skeptical about that. Now, you go into technology and its dangers in the book. I wonder if you could just sort of tell us what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I'm not technologically savvy at all, but I have a little bit of aversion to too much use of it. But I think spiritually, it's worth some thought. That, and my sense of being in New York is that kind of compulsive need for turning to the cell phones, to the internet device. That's a kind of spiritual symptom of the time we're living in. And I do make a comment in the book. I think it's that companionship with the cell phone, that impulsive need for it all the time, that's blocking a deeper hunger of the soul. And it's as though it's substituting for what could be a healthy sense of being alone and having to turn in hunger toward God. And, it's relieving a certain loneliness perhaps in people. They can reach constantly for the cell phone, like a child, almost, holding the teddy bear in some way, and turning to, and what are people are turning to perpetual distraction also with this.
Mm-hmm.
We're collecting, I don't know how many different acquaintances and all the social media. And also much of it is ego driven, perhaps, and in putting things on Facebook and things like this. Mm-hmm. So I find it's very symptomatic of the time we're living in. I mean, I think many people today, unfortunately, are not reading books, real books. Mm-hmm. A lot of their contact with what's feeding their intellect is informational. What's just out there in terms of what can be on a screen. Mm-hmm. And to me, there's an unhealthy symptom there for the soul that we need some silence and an empty space, for God.
Yeah, it's sort of like maybe if we used a nutritional analogy, it's almost like we're just sort of snacking on empty calories all the time. Whereas if we had 3 protein-rich meals per day with lots of space in between, we would be much better off. So maybe if we found a way to use technology in these sort of targeted ways that are going to help us or whatever, but it just seems like it's very difficult for us to maintain that kind of discipline because it's always there in our hand.
Yeah, I think that's a great metaphor. It's snack food, and I think it's like people just drifting through the pages of stuff, flipping pages. And so, I mean, how many people even, in the past gave themselves to time in prayer? And I mean, at St. Patrick's Cathedral, you have people sometimes coming up on a communion line with they're checking the cell phone. Mm-hmm. And, it's just symptomatic of the time that's not good there spiritually.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking about a few years ago, there was a photo, it was going around on the internet, but it was somebody had taken photos of people looking at their cell phones and had removed the phones from the pictures. And what you had were people sort of with these intense or forlorn or sad or happy, whatever, these kinds of pouring themselves into these things, right? But then they were removed and the photos all just looked so sad, like their souls were really, you could just really see it in the photographs. Their souls were in danger, I think.
Mm. Yeah. And the reality is too, that if you're looking at a screen all the time, and of course we're doing a podcast right now, but if you're looking at a screen, you're not facing the unreality of some of the images. And, and in order to have a deeper faith, we have to be able to be present to a God who we cannot see. He's not going to be on a screen just available at the touch of a digital touch.
Right.
So,
yeah, certainly. This leads me to ask you about receptivity. Well, how about we can think of these different ideas of passivity versus receptivity. It seems like when you're looking at your phone, it's just a passive activity in the extreme to the point of just really being unhealthy versus silence, prayer. That is a time that is very different from a lot of other active times that we spend in our lives, but those are times of receptivity where actually there is a kind of activity on our part where we can respond to God's call. You go into that in the book a little bit. Could you tell us about that receptivity?
And I think it's also true with people, to be, receptive to a person is an active thing. Like we can't just be, sitting back and receiving in a passive manner. That there is an active openness, that's part of the life of prayer, but also with people. And I mean, you have seen it. We've all seen this, but I see it a lot in New York where you'll see a couple in their 20s, an attractive couple in their 30s, and, both are on cell phones and, to be really receptive to give oneself fully to another. I know when I had time with Mother Teresa in, years past, that was very striking in her. She was very focused on you, when you were with her. I'm sure that was an overflow of her prayer. She was very focused on God when she was there with him. And I think that's a healthy thing spiritually, that we are facing what's real in front of us and, completely open as much as we can. So,
isn't it funny, Father? You probably experienced this in your ministry, that a real human being will come into your presence and will apologize for taking your time away from your electronic device or your computer or whatever it is, as if like that's real busyness, that's real work. I mean, sometimes that happens to me, and I'll say, "Don't be ridiculous. I'm not too busy to talk to a human being," But our mindset is so skewed now away from, we treat each other almost as inconveniences rather than gifts, rather than blessings that we're meant to attend to.
Yeah, and then really, if we're dealing with objects all the time, be like a factory worker. Maybe the gadget of the machine is more important than people. Well, we're in a little bit like that now with the turning towards technology all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I think but I think spiritually, we that could be a very important thing, radically, to just say enough and carve out time where we put the cell phone on mute and leave it alone for a time.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm guilty of doing that too much. I put it on mute and I forget to turn it on for 2 days or 3 days.
Yeah. Well, it's funny how when you come to rely on these things, if if there's someone in your life who isn't so addicted to his or her device, but you need to get a hold of that person, you feel angry because you think, why is that idiot turned off his phone? I need to get a hold of him. But maybe those of us who feel that way should relax a little bit and not feel so not feel so caught up in the technological addiction.
And who knows where it's going in time? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the fact is, science is amazing how it in its inventiveness and creativity. I'm not sure where we're going in the next 10 years. I mean, I guess the experts have some idea, but what happens with artificial intelligence,
Mm-hmm.
what happens in all this, and people may be living much more in a virtual world of unreality. That would seem to suggest the loss of God is going to be, much more deeper as time
Mm-hmm.
goes on.
Yeah. Let's talk about the Eucharist for a minute, because if there's anything that we believe as Catholics is an experience of the real, the realest of the real, it is our Lord in the sacrament of his body, blood, soul, and divinity. But, to come back to maybe some issues related to the church or uncertainties, do we have the right mindset when it comes to the Eucharist? Where are we going wrong with that?
Well, I personally feel, especially after being at St. Patrick's Cathedral for 8.5 years now, that we need to address this problem of sacrilege. And I think many people they're not catechized properly, and priests are not mentioning it maybe from the pulpit. But we need to correct the reception of communion when it's done in a manner which is not respectful of Catholic teaching on that. I mean, if you're not going to Mass every Sunday, you can't just walk into an occasional Mass and go to communion. Mm-hmm. There are people who are, in mortal sin, and they don't realize it's mortal sin. But we need to get that clear, because I think that's a terrible wound to the Church and to the heart of our Lord, if people are taking communion and they really don't realize the serious sacred reality of what's happening there. Mm-hmm. Many times I've said to people in confessions, who might be, receiving communion sacrilegiously, I said, that can be like spitting at Jesus, on the cross. Mm-hmm. You don't want to do that. It's not the same as other kinds of sins, so we don't want to do that. And yet I see that a lot in the cathedral. It's not just non-Catholics coming up to receive. That happens. But many Catholics who seem that they don't know, they haven't been to communion in a while. They probably haven't just come from the confessional either, mm-hmm. but because it's a big church and a cathedral, I think that needs to be addressed in the church.
Did it seem to you, as I mentioned before, I came into full communion with the Catholic Church from a Protestant background, and confession has been for me truly the game-changing aspect of being Catholic. Yes, I could wrap my head around the Eucharist and, the important that Christ is really present, all of that sort of thing, but that it's incumbent upon me to prepare myself, is something that is completely alien to the Protestant mind. It really is. But in your experience as a priest or just as a Catholic in general, do you think it was more the case in the past that Catholics were better catechized about the importance of confession? Or where do you think that's kind of gone wrong, where now confession is almost sort of relegated to the side a little bit, and maybe not made use of like it should be?
Well, I think in part the problem there is the unawareness of there's a difference between grave sin, mortal sin, and venial sin. And the necessity to make use of the confessional if there's mortal sin, that seems to have been lost, because I think young people for some decades now as teenagers, they were not hearing, that Catholic teaching. So, I mean, at St. Patrick's Cathedral, we do have a lot of confessions, and some are regular, confessions. Many times there are people who are visiting and they see the line, and that is a moment of grace, and they get on the line, and the priest can help them if it's, 15, 25, 35 years. That's not unusual there. What I do find, though, too often is that people, they may have, serious sin and they know it, and yet they still go to communion. So that seems to be something in the church. I don't know that that's just going on in the geography of St. Patrick's Cathedral. I suspect that's all over the church. And I don't think they really addressed that even when we had the U.S. Beautiful Eucharistic Congress in the summertime. But that needs to be really, spoken of, because once the sacredness of the Eucharist is realized, then that affects the church, much more deeply. And there's no shame in not going to communion. That's why, the reality of when the old church had more fasting, before the reception of communion, it was easier in a way to, not to go to communion at a Mass then, if you needed to go to confession first.
That's a good reminder. Thank you. Yeah.
But the reality of indifference, I think indifference to what's going on in the Mass, casual reception, treating the most sacred reality we have in the church, the real person of Christ, under that disguise of a host. There are churches in New York, maybe in other places in the United States, I'm sure, where some priests have put kneelers in, people receive, they don't have to, but they put the kneeler there and give the opportunity for receiving on the tongue kneeling. Mm-hmm. And then it seems everybody receives, very quickly in that parish in that manner.
Yeah.
And, those kind of sacred moves, I wish we would do that at the cathedral, frankly.
Yeah.
We have an altar rail. Why not use it? And I think that could increase right away the sense of how sacred the Eucharist is.
That does kind of seem, of all the innovations, that seems like a strange one. Like, to take away kneeling before our Lord is, to me, of all the things that you would change, that seems a little funny. But, who am I to say? But I'm encouraged to hear that there are places where there's more kneeling going on.
I mean, I agree with that, Andrew. I didn't think of it too much when I was teaching in seminaries, but when I went to St. Patrick's, the reception of communion in the hand, some people can do that in a very reverent way, but that has opened the door to, too much casual, approach to the Eucharist. Mm-hmm. Kneeling and receiving. I've never seen a person, we have many people who kneel down in the aisle in front of the priest, a certain amount.
Sure.
Those are always very, very reverent people when they do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's talk about a couple more things before we run out of time. You write really beautifully about humility in the book. And I wonder if you could say more about sort of what the specific character of humility looks like, as opposed to maybe, other good virtues like modesty, other good ways of being. But what is humility really, and how do we embrace it?
Well, my thought is that, first of all, that God is humble. And I include that in that chapter on humility, that we're actually seeing the reality of God as humble in the Passion of Christ. Mother Teresa used to say that often, that God is humble. And he's humble in coming into this world in Bethlehem in such poverty. And I think our own humility is a very, perhaps if we can pursue that, it will come as a grace from our prayer, placing our nothingness before God, this God who gave himself to the passion in this manner, and that, we really do hear again and again, maybe Jesus, even from the cross, saying to us, apart from me, apart from my passion, you can do nothing. And that sense that really we can't do anything except united to him, and really as beggars before him. So I think, it's a lifelong quality or state that we want to cultivate in our prayer, that I need you for everything. I'm dependent on you for everything, not in a passive way, but we have to come before him as souls in need, constantly. We're nothing without him. We can do nothing.
That strikes me. I for a while, I was really nourished by the book, The Imitation of Christ by St. Thomas à Kempis. And he says, I am nothing and I can do nothing, often in that book. And I remember sharing with a friend once that I was really moved by that and wanted to kind of embrace that. And he said, "What? Don't be ridiculous. You're not nothing." And I said, no, I am in this very real way, not in this worldly way where I feel like I'm a loser or I feel sorry for myself. But no, I, as a creature, am utterly dependent on him who made me. It seems like we need to hear more of that sort of thing in the world.
And we need to hear it, in the spiritual sense, because we can actually do many things. We can do many worldly things. We can have all these, the creativity of, science. We can accomplish a lot. We could become very rich, or we can do things, but we can't do anything fruitful spiritually apart from him. This is why the need for prayer is so important. If priests don't have serious prayer, or then if the church doesn't have serious prayer, our fruitfulness is going to be very diminished. Nothing good spiritually happens except that we have turned to him, asked for his, his grace and everything, I think.
Not to put you on the spot, but do you feel that a lot of your brother priests are lacking in a rich spiritual life, in the sense of like not putting enough energy into prayer?
Well, I don't think prayer comes naturally. So I think when, I taught in the seminaries for 20 years, and I saw some men from the beginning in the seminary life, who was serious about prayer. And I think many priests do not pray much. They do their obligatory prayer in the breviary if they're faithful priests. Some don't do that perhaps, but, I think sometimes prayer is minimized because it doesn't come naturally. Mm-hmm. You have to choose for it. The beauty of this is that if you begin to choose, and there are many priests who pray, they want to pray a holy hour every day. They spend at least that hour, and before the Blessed Sacrament every day. I know Cardinal Dolan does that every day. He puts himself before a tabernacle every day, at least an hour. That's a different life then, but we have to choose it. And I don't think that comes easily. Once a person gets busy, it's easy to make excuses that I'm very occupied. I'm important. I have all these things to do. I think we have to pray. We have to choose to pray in the morning. I remember when I was a priest studying in Rome, about 10 of us who were priests asked Mother Teresa to give us a little talk, to spend a little time with us. We went to a chapel of the Missionaries of Charity, and at the end of that, time with her, she said, she had a sense of humor, but also a little sharpness. And she said, I think the problem of priests today is they stay up too late watching TV and they don't get up early in the morning to pray. Mm-hmm. And if you don't pray in the morning, you're going to lack a fruitfulness in your day as a priest. So I think that's true for all of us, to try to carve out time for our Lord, even with busyness.
Yeah, it's been said, I think, the busier you are, the more you need to make time to pray. You don't have time not to pray, I suppose, is one way to think of it.
Mm-hmm. I remember a priest when I was in the seminary, I always remember this. He said, you make appointments for everybody else during the day. Why can't you put into your appointment book an hour with our Lord?
Yeah.
That made sense.
Yeah. I'm a big believer in that. Absolutely. And actually too, maybe relevant to people picking up your book, making time to read, you have to make time for these things that are good for your soul. Increasingly in this world where there's always going to be distractions, it's going to feel more and more like a sacrifice, but it's worth it.
And it pays off. And once people begin praying, going to holy hours, for instance, I don't see them backtracking most of the time. You get a taste for God, and that taste for the mystery, the attractive presence of our Lord tends to, take hold then and stay.
Yeah. It's amazing how quickly you can create a whole new habit that transforms your life. Let's go out on this, Father. You kind of end the book talking about the idea of being a victim of God's love. We live in a culture that very much emphasizes a kind of victim mentality, and is always sort of challenging us to think in terms of who has more power than whom, and and all that sort of thing. But you invite us to think of ourselves as victims of God's love. What do you mean by that?
Well, that phrase is from a phrase that Jesus used with Mother Teresa in her original locutions when she was beginning the Missionaries of Charity. And he told her, I want sisters who will offer themselves as victims of my love. And that's not, normally we think of a victim as someone who has been victimized, hurt in some manner something destructive by another person. But Jesus, using that phrase, a victim of his love, that he will have an excess of love for the soul that's open to him. And that an excess of divine love is bound to bring, perhaps something overwhelming, something maybe, of suffering into a life. But in excess of, he's going to unite us more deeply to his own love. And it can be that, we end up then maybe loving too much in our lives and pay a price for loving too much. I don't know that any saint would say, well, I regret loving too much in my life.
Yeah.
Sometimes I think that's what's going to happen there. A victim of his love is someone who finds loving, beyond what they would have expected in their life is costly, and yet, would never be exchanged for another life.
Yeah, well said. And we've just scratched the surface here on so much wisdom that you offer us, Father Haggerty, in your new book, The Hour of Testing Spiritual Depth and Insight in a Time of Ecclesial Uncertainty. It's now available from Ignatius Press. Father Donald Haggerty, Father, thank you so much for agreeing to take the time to talk to me today.
Oh, thank you so much, Andrew, for having me. I appreciate it.